Hello students, today we will discuss a very controversial and widely debated issue that is called humanitarian intervention and how that has been replaced with a new concept called responsibility to protect. So, in recent years, particularly in the post-Cold War period, there has been an attempt to reformulate almost all concepts and giving them contemporary meaning and contemporary, making them more acceptable and wider in scope. So what we will do is we will proceed with our discussion on humanitarian intervention in the following manner. First we will discuss the background of the whole issue, the whole controversy about humanitarian intervention. Then we will try to understand what is the meaning of humanitarian intervention. Then we will discuss what are the humanitarian emergencies in different parts of the world and how those humanitarian emergencies have actually shaped our understanding on humanitarian intervention. Then we will discuss why other states intervene in some other countries' domestic issues or why they undertake humanitarian intervention. Then we will discuss the debate about the case for and against humanitarian intervention. Now let us start with the background. The state system has traditionally been based on the principles of sovereignty, non-intervention and non-use of force. So these are the three main principles on the basis of which international system or the state system at the international level operates, and these three principles are in fact codified during the Treaties of Westphalia. Nevertheless, it has been recognized that intervention may be justifiable on humanitarian grounds such as prohibiting genocide, forbidding the mistreatment of civilians and recognizing the basic human rights of the citizens and the non-citizens. So on the one hand, we have a situation when the state system operate on certain principles like sovereignty, like non-intervention and the non-use of force in international relations, particularly for solving different kinds of interstate disputes. On the other hand, we have a situation when humanitarian intervention is justified if some countries or governments they indulge in genocide or they mistreat their own citizens, or they don't recognize the human rights of their citizens and non-citizens. Therefore, there is a tension between humanitarian principles and the principles of state sovereignty and non-intervention in other states' internal affairs. So you have a tension, you have a situation when the principles on the basis of which the state system operate, it clashes with the principles of humanitarian intervention, or what we call the non-intervention as a principle that operates at the state system. Although humanitarian enterprise existed long ago, both the idea and the expansion of the activity particularly at the creation of the post-Cold War period. So particularly if you look at the post-Cold War period, you will find there is a density, more and more resources are now mobilized, and the whole humanitarian support that has expanded in international politics. So on the one hand you have a limited concept of humanitarian intervention because of Cold War politics, because of ideological rivalry between the two superpowers who never allowed any kind of intervention by the other, and on the other hand you have a post-Cold War situation where there is not only just the expansion of the idea of humanitarian intervention, rather there is an expansion of the activities of humanitarian intervention. Three defining trends in the post-Cold War period explain its expansion. The first is the growing willingness and ability of outsiders to help those who are at risk, maybe by their own state government. Radical improvements in information technology revolution and logistical capacities, growing international support for coming to the rescue of the victims, multiplying numbers of relief organizations and substantial increase in available resources, they have all promised an enhanced collective capacity to provide relief, rescue and reconstruction. So in the post-Cold War period particularly, you will find there has not only been globalization that has integrated the different continents and countries, and there is information technology revolution, and there is also a growing support for rescuing or saving the victims of genocide, of ethnic cleansing, of civil war. So in the post-Cold War period, you find certain developments like globalization, that has integrated countries and continents, revolution in information technology, increase in the infrastructural facilities, and there is also a growing support among the countries and the non-state actors for providing immediate relief material and assistance to the victims. You have also increased available resources that could be given to the affected population. So the point is here you find a situation when all these factors combinedly necessitate for more and more assistance to the affected population or the victims of any kind of problem within the boundaries of the state, and that necessitated for an increased role for humanitarian intervention. The second trend reflects the mounting dangers that aid workers confront in war zones where access is difficult, where their own physical safety is in doubt, and where civilian populations are the intended victims. So it's not a question of only providing relief to the victims or not just because we know about their problems through 24/7 television channels. Rather those who were providing succor or those who are providing relief operations to the victims, they were also targeted. They were kidnapped for ransom, and their physical safety and well-being, they were not given any importance or consideration by the entities that created the very problem. So that can also be another reason why there is a lot of importance given to the concept of humanitarian intervention. Third, deployment of military force in such arenas for human protection purposes has raised new kinds of questions about the ability of aid workers to remain faithful to their principles. The aid workers follow the principles of non-discrimination. They respect your culture, they respect your religion, they don't interfere in your domestic issues. So the question is, if there is violence, if there is civil war, if there is genocide, if there is no protection given to them, whether they will be following the same principles on the basis of which they are supposed to work. So that is again another change, another important trend that shaped our perception about humanitarian intervention in the post-Cold War period. Now let us understand what is this humanitarian intervention all about. Once we understand the notion of humanitarian intervention, then it becomes easy for us to understand important issues and debates associated with the principle of humanitarian intervention. Humanitarian intervention is military intervention that is carried out in pursuit of humanitarian rather than strategic objectives. So general objective of humanitarian intervention is purely humanitarian rather than for any strategic objectives. However, the term is highly contested and deeply controversial, not least because by portraying an intervention and humanitarian, it is deemed to be legitimate and defensible. The problem is when humanitarian intervention is just ending in intervention and there is no humanitarian purpose in it, that is again a problem, and that's why many people criticize the whole concept of humanitarian intervention, that by saying humanitarian you are legitimizing and you are defending yourself, or you become very defensive. There are situations, or there may be situations when you are intervening in other countries affairs, when you are militarily intervening in other countries, and you justify that in the name of humanitarianism, or you justify that in the name of humanitarian. The use of the term is therefore necessarily evaluative and subjective. So because of this reason, there is a lot of controversy, there is a lot of debate on the whole notion of humanitarian intervention. Nevertheless, some define humanitarian intervention in terms of its intention. So because of the problems which we discussed, so there are other scholars who particularly define humanitarian intervention in terms of its intentions. An intervention is humanitarian if it is motivated primarily by the desire to prevent harm to other people, accepting that there will always be mixed motive for intervention. So if the states justify humanitarian intervention purely in terms of their national interest, that cannot be ruled out. But sometimes it becomes easy for us if we talk of humanitarian intervention, or if we talk of intervention, particularly in terms of their intentions, whether that is purely humanitarian or it is motivated by their national interest. So sometimes we try to define humanitarian intervention particularly in terms of the intention of the states, whether they are really motivated by the desire to prevent harms to the citizens of other countries, or there is always a mixed motive for their intervention. So that is again a question that can help us to better understand the concept of humanitarian intervention. So just by focusing on the intention of the countries in their military intervention in other countries' affairs. Others define humanitarian intervention in terms of outcomes. An intervention is humanitarian only if it results in a net improvement in conditions and a reduction in human suffering. So we have one definition that is particularly talking of military intervention that is done in the name of strategic objectives, but again the intervention is masked in the name of humanitarian, but the intention is purely strategic. And on the other hand, we have another situation where you can just think of the intention of the country that is intervening in other countries' affairs, whether that intention is basically motivated by the desire to prevent harm to other people, or the motivation is purely national interest. Then we have another situation where the intervention can be humanitarian only only if it contributes for improvement in the conditions and reduction in human suffering. So over the years, there are lots of improvement in the whole notion of humanitarian intervention, but still it is highly debated, highly contested, because it's basically a kind of evaluative and subjective type of notion. Now let us discuss why humanitarian emergencies are there for which states intervene in other countries' affairs. In order to explain the upsurge in humanitarian intervention in the early post-Cold War period, two questions must be answered. The first is, why did so many humanitarian emergencies arise after all? So why there are so many situations for which there is a need for humanitarian intervention? And second important is why did other states intervene? What is their motive? What is their purpose? So that we have to discuss in the context of humanitarian intervention. The early hope for peace and prosperity in the post-Cold War period were soon punctured by the growth of disorder and chaos. Earlier there was a talk of new world order when there was an end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. So everybody thought that there will be progress, there will be prosperity for the world, because the superpower rivalry is not there. So there was a better hope for everything good, everything in a positive kind of situation, but this did not happen, and rather there was growth of disorder and chaos in different parts of the world. This can be explained in two different ways. First, in terms of internal factors, the faults and failings within the society itself. Particularly, you find many of the countries in the global south, there were dictatorial governments, rampant corruption, entrenched economic and social backwardness, and ethnic rivalries. So most of the countries, as we discussed in the context of subaltern realism, they were still fighting the internal issues, and sometimes the internal issues were magnified because of the external environment. So what I am trying to say is, because of this internal problems, sometimes if the countries are multicultural but they are ruled by the monocultural communities, and that created a kind of discrimination right in the constitution, and sometimes the government also deliberately adopted policies that created lots of problem for its own citizens. The second was in terms of external factors, the structural imbalances and inequalities within the global system. This includes the inheritance of colonialism and sometimes the impact of structural adjustment program imposed by the global economic institutions like the IMF and World Bank. So because of the combination of internal reasons and external factor, so there was a lot of problems in the domestic order in the countries facing domestic problem, and that created a situation when there was a need particularly to militarily intervene to stop genocide, ethnic cleansing and civil war. And in fact, when the Soviet Union collapsed, immediately there was lots of problems, ethnic conflicts, civil war, the movement for independence, so many issues were there, not just in the territories earlier controlled by the USSR, but also in the countries like Yugoslavia, like in many other Eastern European countries, and also some countries in Asia and Africa. So the problem is, because of all these internal reasons and external reasons, there was lot of problems in the domestic order, for which there was a need, or there was feeling that these people should be saved, these people or these victims should be helped through necessary humanitarian assistance. Now the question is, why other countries intervene in other countries' affairs? There are 4 factors that help to explain a growing willingness by the governments in the 1990s to intervene in situations in which humanitarian interests are at stake. So it's not just 1 or 2 reasons, rather there are 4 important reasons that need to be understood why most of the countries they feel the need to intervene in other countries' affairs. In the first place, as realists and neo-realists tend to argue, humanitarian considerations often overlapped with concerns about the national interest. So if there are refugee problem, if there are lots of migration issues, so that ultimately affected the state security. So because it affects your state security, so you cannot remain aloof, or you cannot remain immune from these kind of problems, because your concern is your national security, and these issues in a way affected your national security. The US intervention in Haiti and NATO's actions in Kosovo were significantly affected by a wish to avoid refugee crisis and also prevent regional instability. So if you look at the US intervention in Haiti and NATO's intervention in Kosovo, basically they were all motivated to avoid a kind of refugee crisis situation and also prevent regional instability. Second, in a world of 24/7 news and current affairs and global television coverage and communications, government also came under serious pressure for acting in the event of humanitarian crisis and emergencies, what we call the CNN effect. So basically that explains how the 24/7 news coverage of the genocide, ethnic conflict, ethnic cleansing, civil war, how people were displaced from their own native places, what kind of hardships, how culturally they are dislocated, what kind of economic hardship they were suffering from, how the family members they have lost. So these kind of coverage, news coverage, actually pressurize the government to and intervene militarily. So the point is this is one of the reasons why states intervene in the affairs of others, because that is not that is to some extent that is also supported by the people because of the sympathy for what is going on with the other people, or their concern about what is happening with the other people. Third, the end of the Cold War rivalry and the emergence of the USA as the sole superpower created circumstances in which it was much easier to build consensus amongst the major powers favoring intervention. So if you look at the situation at that time, particularly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, how Russia was busy in consolidating its own territories and the other republics, those who were declaring themselves as nation state, the kind of ethnic problems, the kind of ethnic rivalries. So Russia was busy in consolidating itself as a state, as the successor of the Soviet Union, and also in a way it was also impacted by the developments that were going on the nearby countries. At the same time, China was also looking at its domestic issues, for example focusing on economic development. So in a way other powers, they were not interested for this kind of issues, and that provided the United States a kind of opportunity to favor intervention in other countries' affairs. Fourth, in view of high expectations about the possibility of building a new world order, politicians and other policymakers were willing to accept that the doctrine of human rights that lays down accepted standards for ethical conflict. So at that time, most of the countries, particularly the United States, it thought that there is a consensus that human rights is an important value that the liberal democratic countries must focus on, and in the name of protecting human rights, the USA also intervened in many countries' affairs that we know about Afghanistan and Iraq. The idea of human rights provided the basis for attempts to establish when and where state had to right to intervene in the affairs of other states. So basically, you will find that the whole notion of human rights and the whole notion of protecting human rights provided the basis for humanitarian intervention, and also the question of when and where you have to intervene militarily in other countries' affairs. Now let us discuss about the case for and against humanitarian intervention. The case is made for humanitarian intervention on the basis of several reasons. The first is human security. Emerging in the 1990s, the concept of human security approach called for the reconceptualization of security to focus not only on the security of the states but also the security of the individuals and communities. So the whole concept of human security emerged in the early 1990s, and it not only talked about the security of the state only, rather it talked about the security of the individual and also the communities. This raised important moral, legal and practical questions about whether states should lose their sovereign rights if they systematically abuse and target their own population. So states had their own sovereign rights to govern their own territories, so they have also the responsibility to protect their citizens and non-citizens, and the humanitarian intervention is particularly justified in the name of moral, legal and practical issues. So in that way, humanitarian intervention was justified on moral, legal and practical basis. The second is the legal argument on the basis of which humanitarian intervention is justified. There are some scholars who make a case for a legal right of the individual and collective humanitarian intervention which rests on two claims. So basically, there is also a legal basis for humanitarian intervention, and this legal basis is justified on the basis of two factors. The first, the UN Charter, particularly its preamble and Article 1, Clause 3 plus 55 and 56 commits the states to protect fundamental human rights. So as per the Charter and preamble, states are bound to protect the human rights of their citizens and non-citizens. And secondly, there is also a right of humanitarian intervention in customary international law. So those who advocate humanitarian intervention on legal grounds, they say that both in terms of UN Charter and on the basis of customary international law, humanitarian intervention is justified on the ground that you have to protect the human rights of your own population and those who are also residing within your state boundary. Critics, however, say that these arguments exaggerate the extent of consensus about the rules governing the use of force, and that their reading of the UN Charter's textual provisions actually runs contrary to both majority international legal opinion. So those who disagree with this viewpoint, they say that majority of the international legal experts, they don't think that other countries can intervene militarily in other countries' affairs on the basis of UN Charter or maybe customary international, because it is not explicitly mentioned in either in international law or in the United Nations Charter. There is also a third reason, that is the moral case. Many writers argue that irrespective of what the law says, there is a moral duty to intervene to protect the civilians from genocide and mass killing. So there are some international scholars who particularly think that it is not necessary that there is a legal basis, there is also a moral basis, and the moral basis is if the civilians are killed, if there is genocide, there is a mass killing, the other countries, it's also a responsibility of the other countries to intervene and to protect them. They argue that sovereignty derives from the state's responsibility to protect its citizens, and when there is a failure on the part of that particular state to do its duty, then it should lose its sovereign rights. So sovereignty is conditional. It's not that you will rule your people or you will govern your people the way you want. Rather your sovereignty is conditional in the sense that you have to rule them through better governance, and if you fail to protect your own people, if you indulge in genocide and ethnic cleansing, then your sovereignty cannot be respected, and in that sense other countries have a right to intervene in those situations. Then there are arguments against humanitarian intervention, and there are in fact 7 key objections found in the writings of realists, liberals, feminists, post-colonial theorists and others against the notion of humanitarian intervention. First, there is no basis for humanitarian intervention in international law. So as I said, scholars differ whether there is any explicit provision in international law related to humanitarian intervention or not, and most of the scholars they think there is no explicit provision in the international law for humanitarian intervention. So they insist that it would be better if we keep a ban, or if we ban the use of force not mandated or not sanctioned by the United Nations Security Council. When states have acted unilaterally, they have chosen not to articulate a general legal right of humanitarian intervention, rather justified that on self-defense, as you can see in case of India in Bangladesh liberation movement. So whenever there was a situation when state militarily intervene in other countries affairs, they have justified that not in the name of humanitarian intervention but in the name of right to self-defense. Second, states don't intervene in other countries' affairs for primarily humanitarian reasons. States almost have mixed motives for intervention in other countries' affairs, as they are rarely willing to sacrifice their own soldiers' lives unless they have self-interested reasons for doing that. So if you look at the humanitarian behavior of the states, so most of the time, even if they have intervened in other countries' affairs, so it was because of their interest, not because they are concerned with other countries people or plight of other countries' people. Third, states should not risk the lives of their soldiers to save strangers, because political leaders they don't have the moral right to shed the blood of their own citizens on behalf of some suffering foreigners. This is the responsibility of that state government and also the citizen of that country. So if there is anything wrong happens in a country, then the citizens should raise the voice, the government should take the necessary steps, not the soldier of a foreign country, because as the realists argue that the state leaders have no moral right to sacrifice the blood of their own soldiers for the cause of the foreigners. Fourth is the problem of abuse. In the absence of an impartial mechanism for deciding when humanitarian intervention is permissible, states might expose humanitarian motives as a pretext to cover the pursuit of their national interests. So international law, international organizations, they are not very much clear about the timing of humanitarian intervention, and in the absence of an impartial mechanism for humanitarian intervention, so there may be situation that when state will indulge in other countries' affairs or militarily intervene in other countries' affairs in the name of humanitarian intervention. So that is another objection, or that is another point against humanitarian intervention. Fifth, there is also the problem of selectivity of response, because state behavior is always governed by what governments judge to be in their own interest, so there is always the problem of selective interpretation or selective response about when they choose to intervene. So most of the time you will find that some countries intervene in some issues or in some states, and in other countries they don't intervene. We have the best example of America in Afghanistan and Iraq, but America always keeps itself away from the problem in Africa. So that is again a criticism against humanitarian intervention, because the states always focus on their vicinity, focus on their neighbors rather than countries located in different continents or different places. So that is again the problem. For example, NATO intervened in Kosovo, but there were so many other situations in Africa, it did not intervene. So the point is there is always a selectivity of response, and that is again a problem in humanitarian intervention. Sixth, disagreement about moral principles is another major reason against humanitarian intervention. In the absence of consensus on what principles should govern a right of humanitarian intervention, the most powerful states would be free to impose their own culturally determined moral values on the weaker members of international society. So there is no agreement on certain moral principle. What exactly you think that Western democracy, American democracy, that is the best. So it is not necessary that the countries like Afghanistan or Iraq will consider that. So there is always a problem of disagreement among those countries, those who think that this is right for them, this is good for them. So and that also we have the example that how the Taliban, how the Afghan people resisted the Americans for the last 20 years. So the problem is there is no accepted moral principles, or there is a lot of disagreement on moral principles, and this is again for the basis of which many think that humanitarian intervention is not good. Lastly, the humanitarian intervention doesn't work in many cases. A final set of criticism suggests that humanitarian intervention should be avoided because human rights cannot take root if they are imposed or enforced by others. As I had given the example of Afghanistan and Iraq, so you cannot impose your version of democracy or human rights because there are differences in local culture, there are differences in religion, there are differences in the thought process of so many people. So it's not necessary that whatever you think best or whatever you think perfect is actually shared by others. They have different perceptions of about the same, maybe because of their religion, maybe because of their culture, maybe because of their separate historical experience. So this is the basis for which there is a lot of argument against humanitarian intervention. Now let us discuss about the new concept why humanitarian intervention is reformulated and it is considered now as responsibility to protect, or R2P. NATO's intervention in Kosovo in 1999 triggered a kind of major debate in international relations about the circumstances in which the use of force for human protection purposes might be justifiable. So if you look at the NATO's intervention in Kosovo, that when NATO militarily intervened in Kosovo, so that actually triggered a debate that when exactly the international community or the other countries, they have the right to intervene, and to what extent it is justifiable. To find an answer to this question, International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, particularly a commission appointed by the Canadian government, in its report The Responsibility to Protect, outlined two major criteria for justifiable military action. The first was the large scale loss of life, and the second was the large scale ethnic cleansing. So if there is a large amount of loss of life of the people, and there is large scale ethnic cleansing, so on these two occasions the states have the moral responsibility to intervene in other countries' affairs. When these criteria are met, the Commission mentions that there is not just merely a right to intervene, but also an international responsibility to protect those who may be affected by these kind of problems like ethnic cleansing and large scale loss of the life. The world leaders also unanimously endorsed the responsibility to protect at the 2005 UN World Summit, and that again became a norm. The summit's outcome document was later adopted as a General Assembly resolution which mentioned three pillars of responsibility to protect. The first pillar was the primary responsibility of the state to protect its population from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing and crime against humanity, and from their incitement. So these were the specified or explicitly mentioned kind of problems that was the reason for responsibility to protect or military intervention in other countries' affairs, particularly if the local government or if the government of a particular country indulges in genocide or war crimes or ethnic cleansing or even crime against humanity. So that provided the sound basis for responsibility to protect. Pillar 2, the international community's responsibility to assist and encourage states to fulfill their responsibility to protect. So it was made a responsibility by the international community, particularly other countries, to assist that particular country and encourage states to fulfill their prime responsibility of protecting their citizens. So that was the pillar number 2. The third pillar was that the international community's responsibility to take timely and decisive action to protect populations from 4 crimes that we discussed through diplomatic, humanitarian and other peaceful means, failing which more forceful means under chapter 7 of the UN Charter could be enforced. So the point is, first, it was defined what are the crimes that should not be committed, and if the states indulge in those kind of crimes, then the second pillar was to assist that particular country in dealing with the situation in an efficient way, and failing which the United Nations first will try for peaceful means, and if that particular country was not still following those kind of measures suggested by the UN Security Council, then more military measures can be enforced under Article 39 to 51 mentioned under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. Specifically, in the aftermath of the Libyan crisis in 2011, the use of coercive force under responsibility to protect, pillar number 3, that is timely and decisive response, has been scrutinized by a number of member states in the United Nations. So particularly, there was no problem in pillar number 1 and 2, but about the third pillar, that is timely and decisive response, there are still many disagreements among the members of the United Nations. Brazil, for example, proposed an initiative called Responsibility While Protecting, that is R2P, that calls for greater transparency and accountability in implementing resolutions by the United Nations Security Council, especially with regard to the use of military intervention. So the issue is, it's resolved the deadlock. Brazil suggested that instead of responsibility to protect, rather there is a need for responsibility while protecting, because that will give a kind of better transparency and accountability in implementing the UN Security Council's resolution. The R2P also underscored the importance of not using responsibility to protect as a pretext for regime change, as we have seen in case of Libya and Iraq, or even in Afghanistan. Although some countries like Cuba, Nicaragua, Sudan and Venezuela still consider responsibility to protect as a kind of redecorated colonialism, and suggested that a more accurate name for responsibility to protect would be the right to intervene. Countries like Brazil, India, Nigeria, South Africa and Japan, they are much more comfortable with the present concept of R2P, or what Brazil calls responsibility while protecting. So earlier India had also reservation, but now this concept is much better than the earlier concept of military intervention. So with this we will end the discussion. Thank you very much for your patience and hearing. Thank you.